let's talk about Dark Souls 3.
Cool.
So our review for Dark Souls 3, your review for Dark Souls 3 went up, was it a couple of days ago?
Yesterday. Midnight.
Yesterday?
Yeah, yesterday, early morning.
Cool. 8 out of 10 on GameSpot.com. You've been playing a bunch of it in the office for the past while. We've had you on to talk about it in vague terms a bunch. I mean, Mary and Eric have been playing it a bunch as well. So it's been chat around the office for a little while now.
Sure.
8 out of 10. So I guess we got a bunch of questions for you from the GameSpot audience. But what are your sort of main takeaways from Dark Souls? Where does this fit in terms of the quality of previous games? Where does it fit in terms of a Dark Souls game coming out in 2016 when everyone kind of knows what the format is now?
Sure. It's actually really good. This is probably a question, but it's probably a good entry point for someone.
All right.
Despite the fact that it's the third game in what I think is going to be a trilogy, what I'm pretty sure is going to be. It's a great game. It was bordering on being a 9 for me, but the more I played it and got into the late game, the more it kind of lost its momentum for me and its creativity that the rest of the game displayed so well. And I love Dark Souls. I love Demon Souls, Bloodborne. There are certain games like Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne do such a good job of pushing you through the end game and kind of making your progress up to that point worth it. And there's still very much worth it in Dark Souls 3, but it didn't really have that kind of climax and then really like engaging late game hours that I've come to expect from the series.
Something you were highlighting was something I was talking to Eric about last week as well, which was that there's a decent amount of repetition when it comes to bosses in terms of their like movesets at least.
Well, yeah, I think I said redundant bosses because they're all kind of repetitive in a way, like when you start fighting them enough times. I think the most one boss took me was 8 tries. It's a guy named Pontiff Sullivan, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but yeah,
it's pronounced Sullivan.
Yeah,
I wasn't going to say it.
No, it's something. I try to like lend a little medieval flair to all these.
Nice,
names.
fair enough. Yeah, I like
Pontiff
it. Sullivan. Yeah.
And there were about 3 or 4 bosses later in the game. One of which is one of the main bosses you're hunting down. One of the Lords of Cinder, as they call it. And I was playing them, and I realized I'm using the same exact strategy as I used against this boss, the second boss of the game, or the 4th boss of the game, or the first boss of the game. And they're all still they're well-designed boss fights, but really heavy deja vu kicked in while I was fighting them. And I was like, I'm just staying between this one's legs, which, you play earlier Dark Souls. You do that with a lot of the bigger bosses and a lot of the bosses who kind of thrive on those sweeping attacks, like the 360, so that to kind of keep you off their side. But, you start playing these bosses and you would like to see some more creative liberty later on in the game, but it feels like they kind of, I'm not evaluating their intentions, but it feels like the game feels fatigued after a while because, I'm repeating something I've done earlier, despite the fact that my character's gotten better, I've gotten better, I've learned a lot since I fought that boss 4 hours in as opposed to 20 where I am now. And that kind of, I didn't feel cheated because it's still really fun and there's still a huge reward in killing that boss, but it's still, at that point, I wanted the game to reflect the progress I had made.
Yeah.
Because that's the alluring thing of Dark Souls
Totally.
for me.
That seems like the whole point of the series, or the thing that people love about it so much, is that it respects the player.
Sure.
And like teaches them, requires quite a lot of them in terms of skill. So if you're saying that the end of the game sort of flounders in that respect, then that's got to be a bummer.
Sure. Except for like the last 2 bosses are really great. One's pretty, without spoiling too much, the last boss doesn't do anything completely new, but it's definitely a fun boss, and it's well worth it. It definitely makes sense to have that as the last boss, unless you do, barring any optional bosses, of which there are a bunch. But the last boss in the main story is also, it's pretty creative in terms of how you fight it. So yeah, there are some really bright points later in the game, but not enough to really kind of push me through as much as like Bloodborne or Dark Souls 1 or Demon Souls did.
Real Killer 789 says the formula for the game hasn't changed a lot. I kind of want to talk to both of you about this. The original Dark Souls, or I guess you could say Demon Souls, or Dark Souls, and to a certain extent Bloodborne. These were games that were doing something new, or at least doing something new for a new audience. And obviously that's something that us as reviewers really like a lot. We play a lot of games, so when something does something new, I think we've rated very highly, and so does the audience. Like, people like when they're surprised in a new way. Obviously Dark Souls did that in the past. I'll ask you first of all, Peter, do you think that makes a big difference for a reviewer when now we're talking about, it's the 3rd Dark Souls game, but we've had Demon Souls in the past and Bloodborne, they exist within this sort of group of games. That sort of trick doesn't ring as, it's not as interesting as, this far down the line, surely, right? It can't contribute as much to a wonderful, game review because we kind of know that trick it's coming.
For the most part, when we're reviewing a game that's further down the line in a series, we find someone to review it who has experience. And that's because we want them to have a discussion that is well informed, not to necessarily prop the game up against somebody who's going to recognize what hasn't changed. That said, whether or not that's important is down to the individual who's writing the review.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this has come to my table when it comes to like FIFA and F1.
Yeah.
In that there are like games that do the same thing every year.
Right.
And they do it well. And maybe they don't do enough, and maybe they do enough, and it's kind of difficult to parse. I mean, my biggest criticism of Assassin's Creed Syndicate is that, like, oh yeah, I get that somebody would really love this game, but for me, I feel burnt out on this series, so that's the reason I would personally rate it so low.
Yeah, and subjectivity is very important.
Yeah. So what do you think about this? Were you happy enough just to play another Dark Souls? And I want to say as well, it is weird that we're talking about this when we gave the game a fucking 8 out of 10 because that's a really good review. But there is this weird sort of backlash or, sort of idea on the internet that it's not a 9 or a 10.
These aren't school grades, people.
Yeah.
50 or 60 is not failing.
Yeah, for sure. So what do you think about that in terms of you playing it subjectively? Did this game do enough for you as a Dark Souls fan? Would you have been willing to play another Dark Souls 2?
Well, that's the thing. I think Pete and I had the discussion yesterday afternoon or something, and he said, yeah, reading your review, I got like halfway through it, and I was just thinking to myself, well, this could just be any Dark Souls game you're reviewing right now.
Right.
But then you get toward the end of my review, and that was my point. Dark Souls 3, despite a lot of the things that they've been kind of touting as new, it doesn't do that much new. The main new things I saw was in its structure and how you go throughout its world and how that kind of factors in. I mean, there's the new FP bar, which dictates it's essentially a mana pool for your weapon arts, and that was kind of an afterthought for me. Every once in a while, I would use them, and they are helpful, but it didn't really factor into how I was fighting. Bloodborne has seeped into this a little bit. I think I described this as if Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne had a baby, it would be Dark Souls 3.
Ew.
Yeah, that'd be a grotesque-looking baby.
Yeah, Bloodborne indeed.
And
sorry.
It doesn't do the same thing for me that Dark Souls 1 did. I still think Dark Souls 1, like, even looking back now at Dark Souls 1, I think is still the best in the series, despite the fact, like, even removing any, novelty from it. Like, now that we're on 3, it might just be that I'm tired of the series. I'm really not. I mean, Bloodborne is it's not the same series, but it does so many great new things, and I'm more excited for a Bloodborne 2 now than after playing Dark Souls 3.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but Dark Souls 1, I mean, I actually just started a new game the other day because it came with like the retail copy of Dark Souls 3, and it still does so many things better than 2 and 3. I think 3 is like my third favorite. I think if I had to rank them, it'd be like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Demon Souls actually, which is still a great game. 3 and then 2. Not that I dislike 2, but yeah, I think in hindsight, it's weird looking back at one because usually, like you said, on the third of a trilogy, they have to kind of try to keep the momentum going however they can. I still think 1 holds up better than any of them. Yeah, it's a great game, and 3, a big thing with reviewing sequels is how is it different. I don't think 3 is largely that different than the other ones.
Yeah,
and that doesn't make it a bad game. It's a great game. I'd be very surprised if we got to the end of 2016. It's not in my top 10.
Cool.
But yeah, I don't think it did anything really special like the other ones did.
No worries. Got a bunch of questions here about Hero at the top and a bunch of other people asking general questions about frame rates, platform to play on, and all that sort of stuff. How does it look across all the platforms? Which one sort of runs the best?
I mean, as you can imagine, it looks better on like a nice PC. It looks good on all of them. The frame rate issues, there were some, and it dipped pretty low, but it was never in a time when it affected the game. The first spot I noticed it is when after you're approaching this boss and there are strong hints that you're about to go up against a boss. So I tried to backtrack to the previous bonfire, and the game does this thing where it just a bunch of these bones rise up and create like something like 30 skeletons, and then the frame rate dropped. But I wasn't really near them. You could just tell the game was chugging.
Right.
So that didn't really affect it too much. There's definitely, I think it runs a little better on PC from what I've seen. They did say there was a day 1 patch or patch incoming that supposedly is going to fix them, and I want to jump back in.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to really affect my review, but the frame rate dips never really affected me. I know Timur in the UK is playing, and I don't think he noticed anything severe, although I am seeing other reviewers that had problems with it. And yeah, that's tough because, I don't know, it didn't really affect me personally, which I'm grateful for, but if the game isn't running smoothly, that sucks. But yeah, I'd say PC looks great, runs well. It's not locked at 30 frames like the consoles are, but the consoles still ran smoothly for me.
Cool. Awesome. So it feels like we've had this in the office forever. Is it actually out today or is it out next week?
No, it's out, Tuesday.
Tuesday.
The 12th.
Next week. All right. Awesome.